Last week, if you heard my teaching at Roots of Faith, it was a broad overview of the entire Exodus. What we're going to get into tonight are a lot of the details that went on during this era, get into kind of more of the nitty gritty. So as I mentioned last time, and I'm going to go ahead and write this, well, let me back up. There are 4 sources for Egyptian history that we have available to us. The first is going to be Manetho, which was a 3rd century BCE priest. He was a scribe. He knew Greek, and it was his task, or he took it upon himself to take Egypt's ancient writings and to translate them into Greek for the rest of the world to know. He wrote a book called Egyptica. This book, unfortunately, is lost to us today. It is, however, known to us through other ancient authors. Josephus quotes from it, Jerome quotes from it, as well as Demetrius also quotes from it. A lot of ancient authors quoted from Manetho's work when they talked about ancient Egypt. So it's assumed that he had access to a lot of the documents that we do not have today. Some of them perhaps perished in Alexandria, which I know kind of gives you a cringe when you think of it, with the library at Alexandria. But some of them have actually survived. We have the Palmyra stone, and we have funerary biographies that are written on the walls of different mortuary temples. We today call them sometimes pyramids. This is where people would have been buried, and sometimes they would have a biography about their life or certain things that occurred during their life. The Palmyra stone has several different languages on it, and it has some history there as well. Of course, there is the Rosetta Stone. That is more of a trend of 7 different languages, but it really doesn't give you anything regarding Egyptian history. You also have king's lists, and you have the Royal Canon of Turin. The latter, the Royal Canon of Turin, is the one that really addresses the area, the transition from the 2nd intermediate period into the New Kingdom. This is where our history takes place regarding the Exodus. We are beginning, Stephen, on pages 429 and 430. So we're just doing a broad overview at this point in time. So those are our 4 basic sources of information. Now, scholars for the Exodus embrace several different dates, and I'm actually going to type these. The ultra low date is going to be 1150. This is based on the Minerva scale. The other date is 1250, based on the reign of Ramses. Then the date that most biblical scholars will embrace is going to be 1446. Those are usually your accepted or proposed dates for the Exodus, and I'll give you a brief overview of each one. The Minerva stele is, or sometimes it's called the Israelite stele, is viewed as perhaps being commissioned shortly after Israel's Exodus. It is the first known written document, and it stands about 6 feet tall when I say document, but it is a stele, an inscribed stone, where the King Minerva, king of Egypt, he succeeded Ramses. Ramses lived for about 67 years, had a very long reign, and his son Minerva, who himself was a very old man when he came to the throne, reigned for only about 8 to 10 years. So during this 8 to 10 year reign, he made an invasion into Canaan, and he lists all the people that he conquered or that he came in contact with. One of the people that are listed on that stone is Israel, but they are listed as a people and not a nation. So this causes scholars to think that Israel had only been in the land very recently, perhaps signifying a very recent exodus out of Egypt. So those are the low dating people. That is the date that they embrace. The next and most widely acclaimed date, pretty much universal among most scholarship, is 1250 BCE. This date is is endorsed, number one, because of the name of Ramses. We have Israel living in Pi Ramses, which means house of Ramses. We have them exiting from Python, which again is a New Kingdom term. We also have, perhaps could be interpreted, a loss of labor, although this is very, very speculative and not a theory that most scholars modernly embrace. But there are some wine sealing jars that could be seen to have decreased during his reign. But again, this really, the evidence for Ramesses more than anything is based on scripture's use of the term Ramses within the biblical text. You do have within the land of Judah, or within the Judean hills, you do have some limited signs of destruction. If you think of Israel coming out of Egypt, 40 years later, they're entering into Canaan. You have limited destruction in the Judean highlands. So scholars interpret this as perhaps evidence of the conquest. But as Israel Finkelstein is very correct to point out, this destruction is very, very limited. It's really isolated specifically to the Judean highlands, to the area north and south around Jerusalem. So it's not, and then down into the valley, Megiddo in the north. So it is not something where it is widespread destruction. And this is why you have scholars that therefore decry that there is no Exodus, that no Exodus ever happened. And if you're looking for it in around 1250 BCE, you have a really firm leg to stand on. The last date that is traditionally accepted is 1446. And this is accepted because when you reconstruct biblical chronology, 1446 pops up. It is really based more than anything on 1 Kings 6:1, where it says that it was 480 years since Israel's exodus until the beginning of construction on the first temple, Solomon's fourth year. So if you take 960 BCE and you go back 480 years, you end up at 1446 BCE. So this is how scholars reconstruct this era. Now, there's problems with each of these proposed dates. The biggest issue is the fact that when you look at the judges' chronology, when you take the reign of each judge, and there's a specific formula given in Judges 2:16 and 18, where it states that one judge reigned, there would be a time of apostasy, after him another judge would reign. And this is kind of considered a formal statement as to how the book of Judges should be interpreted. So when you look at this statement and you look at the history within the book of Judges, you find that that is indeed the case. So when you add up all the reigns of Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, you add up all of the people, as well as the times of oppression, 20 years by Hetzor, another, say, 8 years by Moab. When you add those reigns, when those times up, you find that it comes up to 410 years. So a 1250 Exodus date only allows 170 years for the entire Exodus period, which really is not enough. So when you go through, the other issue that you have is the use of the term Ramesses. Scripture does not necessarily refer to Ramesses as the king of the Exodus. He is referred to as being a location that Israel was familiar with at the time Israel's archives were updated. A case in point is Genesis 47:11, where it states that Joseph ruled over the land of Ramses. Well, no scholar, even your most critical scholars, they all agree that that is a gloss. It's a later addition to the text that clarifies the region from which Joseph would have administered under his duties as vizier. But no one recognizes Ramses as the actual king or monarch under whom Joseph served. So we could extrapolate that to include the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Just because a Ramses is mentioned does not mean that he is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Another factor to consider this. Okay, and Stephen states, Ramesses is from the name of an Egyptian god, necessarily named for the pharaoh at a time. That is true, but according to the biblical context and the term that is used, it's pretty indicative of a pharaoh or a place name. Pi Ramses, which is listed as the place from which Israel left, was known as House of Ramses, and Ramses is a derivative of the term Ra, the god of Egypt, the sun god. He was kind of recognized as their supreme deity when you look at other nations. So even though Israel would have departed from the city of Pi Ramses, it doesn't mean that they departed during the days of Ramses. And as we get into this, you'll understand why I'm saying that. I'm going to set that aside for now, kind of table it as we go through some of this other evidence. But when we come back to it, I think you'll understand why Ramses, the entire reference to Ramses, is a later gloss that helped the people that lived during Ramses' days that were living in Israel understand the biblical text as the scribes updated the archives to make it relevant and bring it up to date for the modern reader around 1250 BCE. So the other thing that you find with these, yes, oh, Hollywood, exactly, Stephen. The other thing with these dates is that they totally discount Japheth's statement that it had been 300 years in his day where Israel had dwelt on the land. Again, a 1250 BCE date does not allow any of this. It doesn't account for the Jubilees, nor does it account for a time of righteousness where Israel actually obeyed the law within the land of Canaan before Israel's apostasy at Bochum. So there are a lot of issues with our current understanding of the Exodus. So what does Scripture endorse? When we look at the campaigns, when we look at all the different ideas, we find that Israel lived in Egypt at a very unstable time. Remember, under Joseph, you had these waves of Canaanites. The Egyptians called them Amu. They were Asiatics who were identified as Amorites that immigrated from Canaan into Egypt. And after a couple of generations, within as little as 100, 150 years, this massive influx of immigrants ended up overtaking the nation, which I think we could learn from that modernly, because immigration throughout history is problematic. You allow a massive wave of immigration, they repopulate, and they end up subduing the native population. And that is what we see happened in Egypt. There was a power shift before the Amu, before the Canaanites migrated into Canaan. Before this, there had been a very interesting thing that could perhaps be interpreted as activities of perhaps as Joseph as a advising vizier, where power had shifted under Senusret, which was a 12th Egyptian monarch. Prior to this, in the 12th dynasty, you had power had become very fragmented underneath the ruling elite. It didn't really trickle down to the lower classes. You had nobility and the nobles that really ruled over Egypt, and then you had the rest of the citizenry. So you had, you know, your wealthy and your poor. There was a great divide. But under Senusret, he did something kind of unprecedented for his era, and that is he took away the titles of people. He took away the nobility, and he instituted a centralized government where it appears people had to be skilled in some way to function in particular offices. This allowed greater freedom for the people, a better administration for the empire, and theoretically less corruption. You know, whether that did or in reality could be debated. Now, let me show you this map. I don't know how it's going to show up here. But this is, if you can see this, and this is on page 436. This is the map of, you have Lower Egypt here, Upper Egypt, and then you have this 6 nome, which I have colored in. This 6 nome was a place where a lot of Canaanites had immigrated, where they had settled during the Second Intermediate Period in Egypt. And about 80 years after they settled there, they revolted. And they began administering themselves. They began ruling over themselves and really did not allow the native Egyptians to really have any say in their territory. And let me catch Stephen's comment here. He says, Velichowski identified the Hyksos with the Amalekites coming in to take advantage of the vacuum after the Exodus and counting the Israelites on their way there. That is, you know, I'm not as familiar with Velichowski, but I do know that that was an older theory. It is not one that is readily accepted today, even among those who kind of toy with the idea of the Hyksos. To my knowledge, very few people are really willing to associate the Hyksos with Israel, and that's at least 2 reasons. Number one, I think there's a certain fear or certain concern that if Israel is identified with the Hyksos, then maybe they're just Amorites, or maybe they're just ordinary people who you know, are no different. You know, are they really the Hebrews of the scripture? The second issue is that if you look at all of the information that you have in play, you find that the evidence becomes very strong. And when you have strong evidence, then you're left with, there might be something real to the Hebrew text beyond just a man-made document. And I think that is something, when you don't have a unity on religion, when you don't understand the ideas and the theology of the text or the philosophy, I think that can present some obstacles to a very strong piece of evidence that is multi-layered. Now, Stephen, I believe you're referring to War of Worlds. Is that correct? Just to give people a context if they want to follow up with it. But he presented a lot of ideas. Some of his ideas in that book have been refuted over the course of the you know, what we've known about cosmology and a lot of his other theories. But he definitely had new and groundbreaking ideas for his day. Now, as we go through this time, we find that Averroes, during this Hyksos period, doubles in size. It becomes twice the size of what Pi-Ramses would be later on. Okay, Stephen says not Israel, but an Edomite tribe. Okay, I'll come back to this a little bit later. I'm going to go through this and we'll catch this in the discussion period. This way we can get it all in tonight. You find that the Hyksos, once they assume power, they start forming alliances. You know, you can't stand on your own, so you know you need a good alliance. They aligned with the Nubians in the south, and they also aligned with the noble classes that had formerly been disposed, say, about 200 years prior, reinstating the noble classes in their positions of authority. So these alliances therefore allow this immigrant class to come to power very, very quickly and to usurp the normal and rightful dynasties that had ruled over Egypt, the native populations. You also find at this time that it is understood among scholarship, and this is subject to change, that the Hyksos, when they ruled over Egypt, they had a base in southern Canaan that was right in the Negev, in the conflux right where the Judea kind of curves around before you get to the Sinai, right in that area is where Sherhuan was, and that was considered the base of operations and a major trading city from which the Hyksos operated. During this point in time, Sherhuan had vast canals that could be navigated. The Mediterranean was about 10 feet higher. So the Mediterranean, with the canals that were dredged through the area, it flowed into that area. And then you had an incredible lively trade between Avaris and Sherhuan and Crete and the rest of the ancient world. So you had a lot of money being exchanged in this process. Now, early on in Egypt's history, you find that the immigrants were readily accepted. Everybody accepted them, and the Hyksos actually assimilated into Egyptian population. And you find that they took on Egyptian names. They dressed like Egyptians, as the old song goes, walk like an Egyptian. When in Egypt, you do as the Egyptians do. But then you find something different begins to happen around 1685. The Hyksos begin more aggressive ideas. There begins to be wars between the Hyksos in the north and the Theban kings in the south, because what happened when the Hyksos overtook the Delta region, that would be that area there in the north, they secured their territory, and the traditional, rulers of the land, say it would be like perhaps the president of the United States having to flee Washington, D.C., and him retreating south to, say, to New Orleans or to Mississippi and setting up a defunct capital that had served as the nation's capital at a prior time in the nation's history, but it was not a current capital. But for safety reasons and because of the political boundaries of the territory you could actually control, the Theban dynasty, which early on was your 12th dynasty, then became your 13th dynasty, and then eventually your 17th dynasty, they had to retreat southward. And they really gave up a lot of territory to the Hyksos, who then really controlled trade and transportation along the Nile River. In fact, documents from this era state that the Hyksos charged exorbitant fees and levied tribute to travel along the Nile. So they really made use of all resources and capitalized on any sort of income that they could from any point in the realm. So you find that during this time, late in the history, say around 1685, and then as you get to say 1635 and 1620, you find that the Theban kings begin to grow tired of the Hyksos making profits off of their lands, taking advantage of their people. So you find that two brothers begin to stand up against the Egyptians, and you find that they really want to overtake their land, and they did this with good reason, because let me read to you what the historians tell us took place during this period. And I am skipping just around just a little bit. If you're trying to follow around, let me tell you what page I'm on now. I am now on pages 438 and 439. So let me share with you what what Manetho tells us regarding the usurpation of the northern Delta region by the Hyksos. This is what he says. He says, Dudamus, in his reign, for what cause I do not know, a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east. So remember, the Canaanites would have come in from the east as they came into Canaan. It says, invaders of an obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily overpowered the rulers of the land, and they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all of the natives with cruel hostility. They massacred some, and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. So here we have a total reversal of fortune. very similar to what we find, with the story of Moshe, and again with that of Israel in general during this period. Finally, they appointed as a king one of their own number, who was Salastus. He had a seat at Memphis, levying tribute from Upper and Lower Egypt and leaving garrisons behind him in the most advantageous positions. Above all, he fortified the district to the east, foreseeing that the Assyrians, as they grew stronger, would one day covet and attack his kingdom. So here we have Assyrians as a force very early in Egyptian history. This dates to even predates Kassite Babylon, what is termed the Old Babylonian period. It says, in the Sayet or Sethrot Nome, he founded a city very favorably situated on the east of the Bubustes branch of the Nile, and called it Alvarez, after an ancient religious tradition. The place he rebuilt and fortified with massive walls, planting there a garrison of as many as 240,000 heavily armed men to guard his frontier. Here he would come in summertime, partly to serve out rations and pay his troops, partly to train them carefully in maneuvers, and so strike terror into the foreign tribes. So what we find, and let me just keep reading this real quick, because you find that what archaeologists discovered, they have actually discovered steels and memorabilia, such as seals, bearing the name of Dudamose. So Manetho's testimony that we have is backed up by an archaeological record. And as we go forward and we look at this turbulent time in Egyptian history, we are going to look again very briefly, because I did discuss it in detail last Shabbat, but we are going to discuss in detail, we're going to breeze over and discuss this turbulent time in Egyptian history where there was a reversal of fortune. Foreigners came into power and they subdued the native population. So again, there is archaeological evidence of it. And we also find that archaeologically attested is this history that Manetho gives us of the city of Alvarez. Now, Josephus adds to this. He gives us something that is even more riveting testimony as far as associating Israel with the Hyksos. This is what Josephus says. He says, our ancestors, tens of thousands of them, had come into Egypt and conquered the inhabitants. So Josephus here is thinking that his ancestors are the Hyksos, which he's not totally right in that, but it is true that Israel probably could have been considered part of a larger aggregate Hyksos population. He, Manetho, then agreed that they had later gone into exile, occupied the land now called Judea, founded Jerusalem, and built there a temple. Well, we know that the only people that later founded Jerusalem and built a temple there were indeed the Israelites. So you could say that all Israelites could have been considered Hyksos, but not all Hyksos were Israelites. They could have been Canaanites, they could have been Assyrians, they could have been Syrians, they could have been people from a lot of different places that had migrated through Canaan into Egypt. So then what you find is that Scripture tells us that this dynasty arose that knew not Joseph in Exodus 1:8. And this is probably a very accurate description, because what we find of the Hyksos in their early usurpation of the northern part of the kingdom was that they were very, very clumsy with the written Egyptian language. They interpreted things very basely, and they didn't always get the meaning or the context or the connotation correct. So they were just not well versed in Egyptian history or the Egyptian language. They misrepresented the signs of kingship in their memorabilia. They also destroyed Egypt's monuments, which, this is the one thing that, as scholars who study Egypt, we look at Egypt, the one thing that is absolutely amazing is it didn't matter if you had come to the throne and killed your predecessor in order to take that throne, or if you had come by it legitimately and perhaps um, another person had killed your father and came to the throne and then you got it back. Even when there was this shifting of power from one class to another or between one family and another, they still tried to preserve the memory of their predecessor. This was like the most sacred Egyptian tradition, was to preserve the memory of a former ruler. So you have Hatshepsut commissioning funerary rites and supplying temples of her predecessors. Tutmosis did this also. And this is considered in Egyptian culture to be an act of righteousness. When you recommission a predecessor's mortuary temple, you make sure that his epigraphic inscriptions are preserved, and you're making sure that the history and his memory is being preserved. This is basic Egyptian history, culture 101. This is what the Egyptians do. But this is not what the Hyksos do. The Hyksos ride into town having no value and placing no relevance whatsoever on Egyptian tradition. They come in, they desecrate mortuary temples, they actually destroy many of their monuments. Some of those monuments they will recommission in their building projects, but there is just kind of this hostility towards the memory of Egypt in their memorabilia. So when the Exodus 1:8 states that a new king arose that knew not Joseph, he actually has that correct, because the Hyksos didn't value history. They wouldn't have known who perhaps prior pharaohs were, much less their viziers, which Joseph would have been. Now, this is not how it would have been for Egypt. Egypt kept very strong records of their viziers, and we actually have over 30 viziers of the Old Kingdom, I'm sorry, the Middle Kingdom, and we have more than, I think it is 40 viziers of the New Kingdom. So Egyptians kept very accurate and very detailed records of their administration, but the Hyksos did not. It's been conjectured, Van Setters is the one that really runs with this idea, that the Hyksos actually had kind of a democratic system where they would elect their rulers for a period of 2 to 3 years. And after that 2 to 3 year term, they would elect a new official. This is why you see such a turnover rate. In about a 100-year period, you have about 50 to 60 rulers within about 80 to 100 years, because that turnover rate is just so high among their rulers. So in some ways, it's almost as though the Egyptian monarchs respected what we call karma. They thought that by preserving their ancestors or preserving the rulers that came before them, by preserving their history, that someone in the future would preserve their own memory for Egypt's posterity. And in that way, they would indeed live on in the afterlife, because you would have a remembrance in that mortuary temple of you for generations to come. But again, the Hyksos did not embrace that view. So we find also, remember, Manetho states that that Saltus reinforced Averroes because he feared the Assyrians. And there is some indication that the Hyksos themselves may have had ties to Assyria rather. In Isaiah 52 verse 4, Isaiah states that the people came, let me just read it. It says, "For thus saith the Lord Yahweh, my people went down aforetime into Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian oppressed them without cause." Now, this could be seen as dual parallelism, contrasted the oppression of of Egypt anciently with Assyria modernly, say in the 8th century, or you could also see this as the oppression of Israel in Egypt by the Assyrian. That is, the latter interpretation is the one that I see being endorsed by the text, mainly because we find a lot of ties with Assyria during this time period. We find that in the latter generations, right around the time when Moses would have been born, we find that there is an inscription that was discovered in a well, whether it was trashed or used in as part of building that well, but it was an inscription that was sent by a administrator within Hammurabi's court. The name Canaan, one of the rulers of the Hyksos dynasty, is actually an Assyrian name. It's an Akkadian name, and as a matter of fact, a ancient ruler within Assyria bears the same name. He ruled it, I believe it was a couple hundred years before, but it shows the affinity between the Semitic names of Canaan, both for Assyria and again with the Hyksos. So we do have those very strong ties with the Assyrians. We also find that during this time period, and taking into consideration that the Hyksos kings were turning over every 2 to 3 years, this is really gives you the background setting of Moses's birth. Aaron was born in, let me look this up real quick. Aaron was born right around, hold on, I'm getting ahead of my notes here. I believe Aaron was born right around 1641, whereas Moses was born in 1629. How is it that Aaron's birth was not an issue and Moses's was? Well, you find that when Canaan came to the throne, he really instituted drastic changes in policy to the previous era. Remember, in the previous era, there had been alliances made with Egyptian nobles. There had been deals struck with the Nubians. Well, now it really takes on to a new level. All of a sudden, the Hyksos king becomes Pharaoh himself. This is really a new tradition for the Hyksos. You find that the seals and the impressions become more Egyptian. And then they begin this real aggressive policy towards the Theban. They're not really happy with just controlling the Delta region. They want Thebes as well. So you find that during this time period, they begin to target those that show any sort of loyalty to the traditional Theban monarchs. This would have been, remember, Manetho talks about how they began to enslave native Egyptians. It's very possible, if Israel was one of the first immigrants to Egypt, that they assimilated to some degree. And remember, Joseph, Pharaoh had told Joseph that his brothers, if they showed any man of industry among them, to set him as the ruler over his cattle. So the fact that Joseph's brothers, the family, may have had ties to the Theban government, may have marked the Israelites as being confederate with the native Egyptians. So therefore, they would have been oppressed within that category. You also find that, you know, the whole idea of Moses being born and the way in which he is born is not necessarily out of context. Throughout the ancient world, whether we look at Assyria, we have stories of infant or child abandonment, where the child is abandoned and he goes on to accomplish great things. These are not just, you know, mythical folklore. There's perhaps some truth to them. At least Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer believes so. You had a common code of baby safe laws, which we actually do modernly as well, where you could abandon a child in hopes that somebody would take care of that child, and you could abandon it without recourse. In the case of Jochebed, you find that she really had no other choice. If she kept the baby, he would be slaughtered before her eyes. If she threw the baby in the river as commanded by Pharaoh, she would then be obeying the command of the king by putting him in a basket, but yet she would not be delivering him to death. So she kind of delivers him up to God and for God to take care of him. So when the Egyptian princess comes to the water, you find that she takes the baby out of the water. And this is not, the name of Moshe is not just a name that is necessarily a Hebrew name. It is probably an Egyptian name. And I say this because of the theophoric Mose, which means to be born out of. And I'm going to read this. This is on page 444. It says, Missy was a very common element in the theophoric names. Even Van Setters acknowledges that a few would dispute that it derives from the Egyptian verb misi, which means to give birth, a very common element. Now, what's fascinating, it is really only at this point in time where you have the period of the end of the Second Intermediate Period through the end of the 18th dynasty, that you have this very common use of Mose being attached to all the names. You have Mose, Kamose, Tutmose. So it's a very common name during this time period. And that Moses would bear that same theophoric name more than likely indicates a very common affiliation with this time period, because you do find that it does indeed fall into disuse, and it's not really used that much in the future. You also find, there's this notion that because Moses was adopted by a daughter of the Pharaoh, that he would have been considered a prince in Egypt. This is really a very Victorian, a very modernized, perhaps Charleston Heston idea of Moses being a prince of Egypt, and very far from the truth. Again, Hoffmeyer has proposed that Moses would have been just like any other child of nobility during this era. You also had the kings who would go into Canaan. They would deport people from Canaan, bring them back into the service of the king, sometimes as hostages, to secure the alliance and the loyalty of the administrations in other territories that they had subjugated. But you find that Moses would have been educated in a school known as the Cap. He would have been educated with a lot of other dignitaries' sons. He would not have started out. Upon his graduation, he would have been placed in some sort of position of trust, of nobility, of authority within the Egyptian kingdom. And as a matter of fact, there is a story that is strangely familiar to the story of Moshe, where it's called the Entef degree, where you have this son, the daughter, he's referred to as the daughter of Teti, who has done something that offended the temple cult. And let me share with you what the consequence, when we think of Moses fleeing Egypt in the story of Israel's overall exodus, there's a background to this, and this is how Egypt dealt with crime, or with things that were repugnant or things that had offended them to the point of being considered subversive, or perhaps even treason in some way, maybe treason even against the culture according to Egyptian ideas. This is what the decree of Entef says. It says, the temple staff of my father Min has petitioned my majesty, saying, a sorry affair has just transpired in the temple. A hostile attitude has been adopted by, and it doesn't say his name, it just says, damn his name, exclamation point, Teti's son Minhotep. Have him cast forth from the temple of my father Min, have him expelled from the temple office, sons and heirs included, and excommunicated. So this was very important because in Egypt really had a caste society, where sons grew up and they went into the profession of their father. So if you were a physician, your son would be a physician. If you were a priest, your son would be a priest. If you were an architect or a builder, your son would be an architect or builder. So you didn't have the mobility between professions that we have today. So when you cast a man out of his office, you were casting him out of his caste. And when you did that, it was abject poverty, starvation for not just him, but his children and any children that would come after him, because he had no way of earning an income. So he was doomed to be a beggar. It says, his food rations and the contract of his meat salary are to be taken away, so that his name be not mentioned in the temple, as it is normally done to those of this sort, who shows rebellion and hostility against his God. Destroy his documents in the temple of men and in the treasury and on any scrolls of the temple likewise. So you have this decree where this person loses their office, their salary, their belongings, and they're totally given to another person. So if you can imagine Moses being in a similar situation, you can understand why really his only option that he had was to flee Egypt in search of a new life, because he had no life in Egypt. Now, there's also something that's very interesting too. When we look at the possible candidates for who could have been the person in Pharaoh's court who would have drawn Moses from the Nile, you find that there was a treaty made very late in this time period, where there was a temporary peace between the nations, and you find that I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, because the princess that comes later on is much later. She is actually a princess to Apophis, whereas at this point in time, there is hostility. So you do find that there were people within Pharaoh's court that could have drawn Moses out of the water, and they could have raised him as their own. You know, the question remains, would this princess have been Egyptian? Would she have been Hyksos? Would she have been someone within the native population? If she was a native who saw her people oppressed on a day-to-day basis, it is very possible that she could have identified with that and really instilled that understanding in Moses and given him just this love and an appreciation for the underprivileged and the oppressed, and for the ideas of justice. You know, seeing your own people being oppressed, but yet you're living a life that is taken care of, and you are not being oppressed, can really bring that to the forefront. And we find that with the story of Moses. So when we get to the Pharaoh of the Exodus, we are really left with two possible scenarios. Scripture really leaves open the possibility for either an Egyptian Pharaoh or for a Hyksos Pharaoh. And the time period leaves that open as well. The history at which we are dealing with leaves open for both possibilities. If the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Egyptian, you find that he would have been someone who had retreated to Thebes, and he would have been wanting to reestablish his power. But yet, if it was the Hyksos Pharaoh, you find that he would be somebody who is looking to expand his power. He's looking at someone as being aggressive, and he sees the Hebrews as being an obstacle to that. So whether we look at the Pharaoh of Moses' time or the later Pharaoh of the Exodus, it really leaves open the possibility of either Egyptian or Hyksos on either fronts. I think as we come down to the Exodus, I think the evidence really tilts more towards a Hyksos Pharaoh. But at this early time, you know, when the Avaraz became a city, that was in the hands of the Hyksos. The previous dynasty had lived and resided right across the Nile. So they were, this perhaps a situation that was very divided by the Nile arose where you had two rival factions on the branch of the Nile, and eventually one retreated out of the threats of the other. The question is, which side would have ordered the slaughter of the children? Or was there something more going on? Maybe there was an internal coup, a revolution, whereby the traditional monarchs retreated to Thebes as this immigrant class revolted and established their own power and authority in the Delta region. As we continue on, we're going to see more of this play out, and we're going to understand more of this history to see and to reveal who is the more likely candidate for Israel's, both for the king that slaughtered the infants, as well as the later Pharaoh who presided and to whom Moshe resorted to time and time again during the plagues. We're going to come and see him. And as a matter of fact, this latter king of the Exodus kind of gives himself away, because he is known in Egyptian literature for his pride and his arrogance. And when you look at the story of the Exodus, this is really one thing that comes through more than anything else, is this king who says, take away the plague and your people will go, but yet his heart is hardened and he just really becomes full of himself, and he says, no, they cannot go free. So when you look at this, there is one king in the Exodus, or rather in Egyptian history during the Second Intermediate Period, who, according to the Theban kings, is known as a brave ass because for his pride and his arrogancy. And his name is Apophis. Apophis takes and he sends a very inflammatory letter to the kings in the southern Egypt, in Thebes, claiming that their hippopotamuses some 200 miles south are keeping them away at night. When Kamose receives this letter, he doesn't know what to make of it. All he knows is that Apophis is trying to provoke a confrontation between the two monarchs. And it is apparent that Kamose answers him. We know from an inscription that has Kamose's name on it that after his third year, he sacked Avarez. At some point in time, he sacked Avarez. He talks about the incredible ships filled with gold and lapis lazuli and all sorts of precious skins that are confiscated during this sack of Avarez. We also know that Kamose and Apophis die right around the same point in time, mysteriously. And Kamose's younger brother, mysteriously comes to the throne. We're going to look at this in greater detail later on. But we also find, strangely, have you ever heard that a lot of times there is a story behind a story? We find this with Assyria's attack of Jerusalem under Sennacherib. When you go to the Assyrian archives and you read what was inscribed on the walls of Nineveh, you find that there was a king that had revolted against Assyria. And this king, Pattai, had come to Hezekiah and he had sought refuge, and Hezekiah had given him refuge. And this was one of the reasons why Sennacherib attacked Jerusalem. Well, just as with Hezekiah, there is often another story behind the story of the Exodus. And what we find from the very few documents that we have from this era is that Apophis, this arrogant king, who was a Hyksos king, had not only written an inflammatory letter to the southern kings, he had challenged all the gods of Egypt to a duel. He claimed that his god, Baal, was the only god, and that he would challenge them to a duel and to see which god would be with them as victor. And let me read you what it says. It says, "So we shall see the power of the God is with him as protector. He relies upon God, who relies upon the entire land except Amun-Re, king of the gods. So here he is challenging the southern Thebes basically to a duel, to a war, saying, my God will be with me, your God you will perish because your God will not be with you as a protector. My God will supersede. But then what's fascinating in this, in the context of a duel, is that it isn't the Egyptian God, Re, that responds to this duel. It's the Israelite God, who could be considered a subclass of the Hyksos, or perhaps in the Hyksos mind, an alliance with the Egyptians. And it is this deity who they do not know who all of a sudden answers. So you can kind of perhaps understand a little bit of Apophis's arrogance when he sees this unnamed God who he has no context of within the Egyptian cultural or traditions, all of a sudden coming out of the woodwork. And then Apophis thinking, when Moses approaches him, who is the Israelite God that I should even recognize him? So in the Egyptian context and in the Hyksos context, it really makes incredible sense when you see that as the story behind the story of the Exodus. And what's fascinating too is that Yahweh states that with the plagues on Egypt, he says that he will render judgment not only on Egypt, but also on their gods. So there's this idea that Yahweh is showing himself to be the only real deity that is viable among the host of pantheons between Hyksos and Egyptians. So whether you look at either dynasty, neither can provide deities that are actually proactive in protecting their people, except for the Israelite God, who, as we know later on, will separate the Israelites after the third plague and show a distinction between the Israelites and the Hyksos and demonstrate his power to protect. Because what is Apophis's challenge? His challenge is to see which God is with them as protector. So it's fascinating when you see Yahweh answering this call and protecting the Israelites from the plagues that Apophis's God and even the Theban God cannot protect either themselves or their citizens from that wrath or the misery that is placed on them. So next time we're going to be looking at the house of bondage, and then we're also going to be looking at the idea of Israelite armies being in Egypt. This is something that when you look at the text and you kind of go back to the Hebrew, you kind of have an aha moment. Why are there Israelite armies in Egypt? We're going to get into that, as well as some of the archaeology and more of the detail next time. So I hope you guys will join next time. At this point, I will open it up for comments, and I look forward to comments or questions. Cindy says, speaking of Hollywood, I just happened upon the last night and watched the opening shows of the Merneptah Steel Stone. Oh, cool. That is great. I'll have to check that out. I've seen some documentaries on it and read quite a few books on it, but it's always neat when you can see it as close as you can get to it. So thank you, Cindy. Stephen says, I think it was Ages in Chaos by Velikovsky. He was one of the first to suggest that they had the wrong time frame for the Exodus. Okay. Yes, he wrote Worlds in Collision and Ages in Chaos. So I'm actually reading the Worlds in Collision now. Very dry, kind of difficult to get through. I may just skip forward to the Ages in Chaos because that is a little bit more pertinent to what we are dealing with. So any questions or comments? This is new material perhaps for some. Some you might have heard it 3 or 4 times now. Cindy says, not sure it is accurate referring to the Merneptah Steel Stone documentary, but it says, but definitely interesting with all the digs they were showing. Huh, okay, I'll have to check into that. Yeah, the digs, you know, are so politicized now that it's really hard whether you're in Israel or in Egypt to get permits, and most of the sites are claimed by institutions. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. So I'll take a look at that. Any other questions or comments? Now, tomorrow morning, I will be teaching at Roots of Faith again, and you will likely see the same setup in the backdrop. So last week, I tried broadcasting from my living room, and there was some problems with it. We had some, I think, some echo, and the audio wasn't real good. So I think I'm going to stick with this because you can follow it, and it's a lot easier to hear. But we are going to cover the Canaan conquest in one big swoop tomorrow. And the evidence for the Canaan conquest is even stronger. It's like 3 times as strong as for what we have for the Exodus. So I hope you will enjoy it. Hold on to your boots, and I hope to see you all 10:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you for spending your evening with me, and I will see you next Friday evening. Have a great evening. Thank you all for coming, and Shabbat Shalom.